May 1944. The Pacific War is a bonfire, and General Douglas MacArthur is about to pour gasoline on it. His entire plan for retaking the Philippines, his entire legacy, hinges on one tiny, God-forsaken island, Biak. On that island, 11,000 Japanese soldiers, led by the brilliant and ruthless Colonel Naoki Kuzume, are not waiting to die on the beaches. They are hidden, dug into indestructible fortresses of coral and rock, armed with machine guns aimed at every conceivable angle. They are waiting to bleed America dry. The U.S. Army is marching straight into this trap, and they are following a doctrine that is getting them slaughtered. The brutal mathematics of the Pacific War prove it. For every bunker they face, they will lose 3 men. There are hundreds of bunkers. But here is the secret. The U.S. Army has a weapon that can end this nightmare. A grenade so terrifying it can melt steel and suffocate an entire garrison in seconds. But it's locked away, forbidden. Using it offensively is classified as a war crime. What the generals in their starched uniforms don't know is that a 10th grade farm kid from Iowa, a private named Harold Moon, is about to ignite a firestorm. He is about to violate every rule in the book, defy his officers, and force the Pentagon to rewrite its own doctrine, or court-martial him for trying. This is the story of the bureaucracy that failed, and the one soldier who dared to be right. To understand the nightmare of Biak, you first have to understand MacArthur's obsession. By early 1944, MacArthur's island-hopping campaign was a brutal success. But he wasn't just hopping, he was driving. Driving toward one objective, the Philippines. His famous promise, "I shall return," was more than a slogan. It was the entire strategic focus of the Southwest Pacific Theater. But to invade the Philippines, he needed air power. Not just from carriers, but from massive, land-based bomber fields. His eyes landed on the island of Biak, off the coast of Dutch New Guinea. Biak had 3 perfect, strategic airfields, most importantly, the Mocker Airfield. Whoever held Mocker Airfield could dominate the skies over the entire region. For MacArthur, Biak was the linchpin. For the Japanese, it was the final firewall. The Japanese Imperial High Command knew its value. They sent one of their best defensive minds, Colonel Naoki Kuzume. Kuzume was not a follower of the old Banzai Code. He had no intention of wasting his men's lives in suicidal charges on the beach. He studied the American landings at Tarawa and Kwajalein. He saw their overwhelming naval firepower, and he devised a new, horrifying strategy. It was called Mokusaku, strategic silence. He would let the Americans land. He would let them come ashore with their tanks, their artillery, their confidence. He would lure them inland, away from their naval guns and into a fortress. For months, Kuzume's 11,000 men transformed Biak. This wasn't a trench line. It was a fortress system built into the island itself. They used the natural terrain, ancient coral caves, limestone cliffs, and dense jungle, and reinforced them with concrete, steel, and overlapping fields of fire. Some bunkers had walls 3 feet thick. Others were positioned in natural coral formations that made them nearly immune to artillery and naval bombardment. These positions were mutually supporting. Attacking one bunker meant exposing yourself to machine gun fire from 3 others. It was a perfect 360-degree killing field. Kuzume's orders were simple. Hold Biak at all costs. Bleed the Americans for every inch. Make the price so high that MacArthur would have to rethink his entire war. The Americans heading for this trap had no idea what was waiting. They were the 41st Infantry Division, the Sunset Division. They were veterans, but they were trained for a different kind of war. And they were carrying the wrong weapon. Meet the Mark II fragmentation grenade, the iconic pineapple grenade. Since 1918, It had been the standard American hand grenade. Its serrated cast-iron body was designed to explode into hundreds of deadly fragments, with a kill radius of 10 meters. In the open fields of Europe, it was devastating. Thrown into a German trench, it was a war winner. But the Pacific was not Europe. The problem first became horrifyingly clear during the Guadalcanal campaign in 1942. American forces encountered Japanese defensive tactics unlike anything they had faced in training. The Japanese exploited natural terrain, digging into hillsides and reinforcing caves. The Mark II grenade, designed for open warfare, was useless. It was too light. Soldiers would throw it at the small firing slits of a bunker, only to watch it hit the coral wall and bounce off, rolling harmlessly down a slope. Or, if the throw was perfect, the 5-second fuse was too long. It gave Japanese defenders just enough time to pick up the grenade and throw it right back out. The failure rate was catastrophic. Field reports from the Battle of Tarawa in November 1943 were a terrifying wake-up call. Marines documented that only 1 in 12 fragmentation grenades successfully entered an enemy bunker. The rest detonated uselessly outside, while the Japanese inside returned fire, killing the assault team. Each failed throw gave the Japanese time to kill Americans. The U.S. Army Ordnance Department, headquartered thousands of miles away at the Aberdeen Proving Grounds in Maryland, knew it had a problem. They were the experts. The scientists and engineers responsible for designing and approving every weapon the Army used. They responded with a flurry of solutions. They developed special grenade-launching rifles. They designed longer fuses to give soldiers more throwing time, which only made the problem worse. They created complex training courses teaching proper throwing angles. None of it worked. The bunker problem persisted. By early 1944, the Army's weapons experts reached a final, fatal consensus. The Mark II fragmentation grenade was the only safe option for bunker assault. The official field manual, FM 23-30, explicitly stated this. Their reasoning seemed sound. Fragmentation grenades had multiple safety features, predictable fuse times, and proven lethality in other situations. More importantly, they were designed to be thrown. The alternative was unthinkable. The M15 white phosphorus grenade. This grenade was classified as a chemical weapon. It was intended only for smoke screens and signaling. The M15 carried stark warnings in red letters, "Not for offensive use." The chemical inside burned at 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. It could not be extinguished with water. It ignited anything it touched: wood, ammunition, human flesh, and continued burning even underwater or inside the human body. Army safety regulations were unambiguous. Throwing white phosphorus grenades into confined spaces was strictly forbidden. The risk of catastrophic burns to friendly forces from splashback was considered too high. The official doctrine was clear. Using white phosphorus against bunkers was a court-martial offense. The Ordnance Department had made its decision. Doctrine was doctrine. The men on the front line would just have to throw better. The stakes of this single, bureaucratic decision were about to be measured in thousands of American lives. The casualty reports were already stacking up. Kwajalein, in February 1944, cost 372 American casualties. Eniwetok, in March, added 339 more. General MacArthur's staff calculated a grim projection. At current casualty rates, the drive toward the Philippines would cost over 50,000 American lives before the end of 1944. And then came Biak. On May 27, 1944, the 41st Infantry Division landed on Biak, expecting light resistance. Instead, they walked directly into Colonel Kuzume's trap. The naval bombardment had done nothing. The coral caves were untouched. As the 41st Division moved inland, the island erupted. Machine gun fire poured from invisible bunkers. Mortars rained down from hidden pits. The advance stalled. The 41st was losing. Badly. The brutal mathematics that headquarters had calculated were now a horrifying reality. For every Japanese bunker eliminated, American forces were suffering an average of 3.2 casualties. The 41st Division identified over 200 fortified positions on Biak alone. The mathematics were simple and horrifying. At current rates, taking this single island would cost nearly 700 American lives. The division's grenade supply dwindled. Quartermasters began rationing fragmentation grenades, 3 per squad, per day. Officers ordered soldiers to use rifle fire and bayonets to conserve explosives. But rifle fire doesn't penetrate bunker walls, and bayonets don't reach machine gunners firing from cave mouths. By May 30th, after 3 days of relentless, bloody fighting, the 41st Division had advanced less than a mile. They had suffered over 200 casualties. Medical corpsmen were running low on morphine and plasma. The official doctrine was failing. The experts were wrong. And Private First Class Harold Moon was lying in the dirt behind a shattered palm tree, watching his 4th grenade bounce uselessly off a coral wall, wondering if there was another way. Harold Moon was nobody's idea of a military innovator. He was not a West Point officer. He was not a weapons engineer. Born in 1,922 inches, Grundy County, Iowa, Moon dropped out of high school after the 10th grade to work on his father's dairy farm. His service record listed him as average in marksmanship and satisfactory in grenade throwing. Before the war, his biggest decision was whether to plant corn or soybeans in the North 40 acres. Moon received his draft notice in January 1943. He reported to Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, completed basic training, and was shipped to the Pacific as just another replacement rifleman. He was assigned to Company E, 163rd Infantry Regiment. His job was simple: follow orders, shoot straight, and don't get killed. But Harold Moon had one skill that doesn't appear in any Army manual. He wasn't an engineer, but he understood physics, not through equations, but through intuition. Growing up on a farm, he learned to judge trajectories by throwing hay bales into lofts. He learned to calculate angles by tossing heavy tools to his father across the barn. He knew, instinctively, how objects move through space. On Biak, as Moon lay behind that shattered palm tree, his ears ringing, he watched his platoon sergeant throw another Mark II grenade at the Japanese bunker. The grenade hit the coral wall, bounced, and rolled. Moon saw the problem immediately. The Mark II grenade was too light. It was too round. It was too bouncy. It was designed to fragment, not to penetrate. Throwing it at a coral bunker was like throwing a baseball at a concrete wall. Physics guaranteed failure. Moon's moment of insight came from an unlikely source: a mistake. That morning, during the pre-dawn equipment check, someone in the supply chain had made an error. Mixed in with Moon's standard allotment of Mark, 2 grenades were 2 M15 white phosphorus grenades, the chemical weapons. The ones marked, "Not for offensive use." Moon knew the regulations. He had sat through the safety briefings. White phosphorus grenades were for smoke screens. Only smoke screens. Using them offensively violated standing orders. But as Moon studied that Japanese bunker and the bodies of the 7 men from his platoon lying in the open, he saw something the experts at Aberdeen had missed. The M15 white phosphorus grenade was heavier than the Mark II. It weighed nearly 2 pounds, compared to the Mark II's 21 ounces. The fuse was shorter, only 4 seconds, not 5. And the white phosphorus itself had a property that shrapnel didn't. It kept burning. It would fill that enclosed space with choking, toxic smoke and unbearable 5,000-degree heat. Moon pulled one of the forbidden M15 grenades from his web gear. He weighed it in his hand, feeling the solid difference. His platoon sergeant noticed. "Moon, what the hell are you doing? Those are smoke grenades." "They're heavier," Moon said, his eyes fixed on the bunker. "That's not what they're for, Private. Put it back." Moon looked at the bunker. He looked at his dead squadmates. He made a decision that would either save his platoon or get him court-martialed. He pulled the pin. Moon's first throw was perfect. The M15 grenade arced through the humid air, heavier and more stable than the Mark II. It didn't bounce off the coral wall. It dropped straight through the bunker's firing slit, like a stone falling into a well. Moon counted. 1 1,000, 2 1,000, 3 1,000. The bunker erupted, not with the sharp crack of a fragmentation explosion, but with something far worse. Thick, acrid, white smoke billowed from every opening. The temperature inside spiked to 5,000 degrees. The phosphorus ignited everything it touched. Wood supports, ammunition boxes, human flesh. The Japanese machine gun fell silent. Moon's platoon sergeant stared in disbelief. Did that just work?" 70 yards to the left, another bunker opened fire, trying to cover the destroyed position. Moon didn't hesitate. He grabbed his second M15 grenade, calculated the angle, and threw. Another perfect entry. Another eruption of white smoke and chemical fire. Another silenced gun. "Get me more of those," Moon told the sergeant. "Those are smoke grenades, Private. We don't use them for. Get me more." The platoon advanced. Moon moved from bunker to bunker, using the forbidden grenades with the surgical precision of a farmer planting seeds. The heavier weight made them easier to control. The shorter fuse gave defenders no time to react. And the white phosphorus created conditions inside the bunkers that made defense impossible. It was a weapon that seared lungs with every breath. By noon, Moon had cleared 8 bunkers. His company advanced 400 yards, the fastest progress they had made since the landing. Word spread through the battalion, whispered over field phones and yelled between foxholes. "That crazy private in Easy Company. He's using WP on the bunkers. And it's working." Captain James Winters, Moon's company commander, confronted him during a brief lull in the fighting. Winters was a West Point graduate, a man trained to follow doctrine. He had the field manual open, pointing to the regulations. "Private, this is explicitly forbidden. White phosphorus grenades are chemical weapons. They're for smoke screens and signals only. Using them offensively violates the Geneva Convention." Moon, covered in coral dust and sweat, simply gestured toward the battlefield, where medics were loading wounded men onto stretchers. "How many of those guys would be walking if I'd kept using the mark?" 2 seconds that don't work. "That's not the point, Moon." "That is exactly the point, sir. This could be a court-martial offense." "Then, court-martial me after we take this island." Winters stared at the private, then at the manual, then back at the battlefield. He was watching his men die, for 3 days, trying to follow regulations that didn't match reality. He closed the manual. He made a decision that would define his career. "I didn't see anything. But if you get yourself killed doing this, I'm not writing a letter to your mother explaining you died violating direct orders." Moon nodded. "Fair enough, sir." By sunset, Private Harold Moon had single-handedly cleared 20 Japanese bunkers using white phosphorus grenades. His unauthorized technique had enabled his company to advance nearly a mile more progress than the entire battalion had made in the previous 3 days combined. The question now was whether the army would adopt his method or bury him for it. The answer would come 2 days later, in a cramped command tent 2 miles inland. Lieutenant Colonel Alexander McNabb, battalion commander of the 163rd Infantry, read Captain Winters's after-action report with increasing alarm. The report documented Moon's staggering success, but it also described, in careful military language, the systematic violation of weapons regulations. McNabb called an emergency staff meeting. The battalion's officers crowded into the humid tent. Company commanders, weapons officers, the battalion surgeon. Captain Winters presented Moon's results. 20 bunkers cleared in one day. 0 American casualties during those assaults. 400 yards of advance enabled. The numbers were undeniable. Then Major Robert Thornton stood up. Thornton was the battalion's weapons officer. He was a career ordnance officer, a graduate of the Aberdeen Proving Grounds Weapons School. He had spent 15 years studying military explosives. He was the expert. And he was furious. "This is insanity," Thornton said, his voice rising. "White phosphorus grenades are not designed for offensive use. They are chemical weapons with unpredictable effects in confined spaces. We have regulations against this for a very good reason." Winters responded calmly. "The regulations assume our standard grenades work, Major. They don't. Not against these bunkers. Then we need better throwing techniques. Better training. We've had better training for 2 years." Winters shot back. "It hasn't solved the problem. Moon's technique works. The proof is in the casualty reports." Thornton slammed his hand on the map table. "Do you understand what white phosphorus does to human tissue? It burns through skin, through muscle, through bone. It cannot be extinguished with water. If even a fragment of that lands on one of our own men." "Our own men," Winters interrupted, "are dying right now, because we're forcing them to use grenades that bounce off walls." The tent erupted. Officers shouted over each other, arguing doctrine versus results, regulations versus reality. Some supported Winters. They had seen the bunker problem firsthand. Others sided with Thornton. The regulations existed for safety, and one private's reckless success didn't justify abandoning established doctrine. McNabb let them argue for 5 minutes. Then he raised his hand for silence. The shouting stopped. "Bring me Private Moon." 20 minutes later, Private Harold Moon stood in the command tent, still covered in coral dust and mud. He had never been in a battalion headquarters before. He had certainly never been surrounded by this many officers, all staring at him as if he were some kind of alien. Lieutenant Colonel McNabb got straight to the point. "Private, Major Thornton tells me you're using white phosphorus grenades offensively. Is that correct?" "Yes, sir," Moon said. "You are aware that this violates standing orders?" "Yes, sir." "Then why?" McNabb asked. "Did you do it?" Moon considered his answer carefully. He was a farm kid from Iowa, talking to a lieutenant colonel who held his life in his hands. But he was also a man who had watched his friends die for 3 days, all because nobody questioned whether the regulations made sense. "Sir," Moon began, his voice steady, "the Mark II grenades don't work against these bunkers. They're too light. They bounce off. I needed something heavier, something that would go through the firing slits and stay inside. The M15s are heavier, and the white phosphorus, it makes the bunkers uninhabitable." "It works, sir," Major Thornton interrupted, his face red. "It's also incredibly dangerous to our own troops. If that phosphorus splashes back—" "I'm careful about the angles, sir," Moon said, looking directly at Thornton. "I only throw when I have a clear shot through the opening. And I've been doing this for 2 days, and we haven't had a single friendly casualty. 2 days isn't enough data." Thornton scoffed. McNabb cut him off. He turned to the major. "Major, how many casualties has this battalion suffered clearing bunkers since we landed?" Thornton consulted his notes, his anger fading into frustration. 47. Killed or wounded, sir. And how many friendly casualties? McNabb continued, his voice low. There was a dead silence in the tent. McNabb turned back to Moon. Show me. They moved to a captured Japanese position half a mile away. In front of the battalion staff, Moon demonstrated his technique on an abandoned bunker. He explained the physics, the angles, the timing. He threw 3 M15 grenades, each one entering perfectly through narrow openings that the standard Mark II grenades had consistently missed. McNabb watched in silence. Then he turned to the fuming Major Thornton. Major? Effective immediately. You will authorize the use of white phosphorus grenades for bunker assault. Distribute them to all rifle companies. And get Private Moon to train our squad leaders on his proper technique. Thornton was stunned. Sir! This violates Ordnance Department regulations! McNabb stepped closer to his weapons officer. Then the Ordnance Department can court-martial me. We have an island to take, and I am not losing one more man following regulations that get them killed. Meeting dismissed. The results were immediate and dramatic. Within 24 hours, every rifle company in the 163rd Infantry Regiment received supplemental supplies of M15 white phosphorus grenades. Private Moon, the 10th grade dropout, became the most important instructor in the battalion, moving between companies and demonstrating his technique to squad leaders. The training was simple. Identify the opening, calculate the angle, throw the heavier M15, not the Mark II. Take cover for 4 seconds. The battalion's casualty rate didn't just drop, it plummeted. Field reports documented the transformation. Before Moon's technique, the 163rd Infantry averaged 6.4 casualties per bunker eliminated. After adopting white phosphorus, that number dropped to 1.7. And most of those were from enemy fire during the approach, not from the assault itself. The casualty rate for bunker assaults fell by 73%. The technique spread like wildfire through the division. By the end of May, the entire 41st Division had adopted Moon's unauthorized method. The Japanese noticed the change immediately. A diary recovered from a dead Japanese officer, Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto, described the new American tactics with sheer terror. He wrote, "The enemy now uses chemical fire weapons against our cave positions. The white smoke fills the tunnels and makes breathing impossible. The heat is unbearable. Men cannot stay at their posts. This is a terrible weapon that defeats our strongest defenses." The ultimate test came on June 2nd. The assault on Mocker Airfield. This was the strategic objective. The Japanese had ringed the airfield with 68 fortified bunkers, creating overlapping fields of fire that made the approach a suicidal death trap. The 163rd Infantry, now armed with Moon's technique, drew the assault mission. Moon, who had received a battlefield promotion to squad leader, led his men. They advanced across open ground. When machine guns opened up from 3 concealed bunkers, Moon's squad went to work. Moon reached the first bunker, pulled an M15, checked the angle, and threw. The grenade entered cleanly. 4 seconds later, white smoke erupted. The gun fell silent. The second bunker was more difficult, the firing slit smaller. Moon had to expose himself to get the angle, ignoring the bullets snapping past his head. He threw. Another perfect entry. Another silenced gun. His squad cleared 3 mutually supporting bunkers in 11 minutes. Before his technique, that same task would have taken hours and cost multiple casualties. His squad suffered 0 losses. Across the battlefield, other squads employed the same tactics. The 163rd Infantry cleared the airfield perimeter by 2 p.m. An objective that staff officers estimated would take 3 days was secured in 8 hours. The final statistical analysis was undeniable. The 41st Division's after-action report compiled in July 1944, proved Moon's case. Before white phosphorus, 47 grenades expended per bunker, 3.2 casualties per bunker. After white phosphorus, 2.3 grenades expended per bunker, 0.8 casualties per bunker. The 41st Division eliminated 312 Japanese bunkers on Biak. Using the old casualty rates, that would have cost approximately 998 American casualties. The actual casualties were 249. Harold Moon's unauthorized technique saved an estimated 749 American lives on Biak Island alone. His method spread throughout the Pacific. The 1st Marine Division used it on Peleliu. The 96th Infantry Division used it on Okinawa. Field manuals were quietly revised. The U.S. Army Ordnance Department never formally acknowledged that Moon's technique worked better than their approved methods. The manual never mentioned Moon by name. It never admitted that a private with a 10th-grade education solved a problem that weapons experts couldn't. But the production numbers tell the real story. In 1943, the U.S. military produced 2.1 million M15 white phosphorus grenades. In 1945, production reached 11.2 million. The official documents still classified them as smoke. But everyone knew what they were really for. Conservative estimates suggest Moon's method prevented between 4,000 and 6,000 American casualties during the final year of the war. After the war, Harold Moon returned to Grundy County, Iowa. He took over his father's dairy farm, married, and raised 3 children. He never gave interviews. He never talked about the war. He received the Silver Star, but he kept it in a drawer. But in 1982, at a 41st Division reunion, an elderly man approached him. He was the son of Captain James Winters, Moon's old company commander. "My father passed away," the man said, "but he told me to find you. He kept a list of every man in Easy Company who survived the war. He calculated that without your technique, at least 47 of them would have died on Biak. He said you saved his company. He said you were the bravest soldier he ever commanded, because you had the courage to be right when everyone else was following orders that were wrong." Harold Moon died in 1998. His obituary mentioned his military service in one sentence. His legacy isn't in medals, it's in the thousands of men who came home because one private decided that saving lives mattered more than following regulations. He saw a problem. He saw the solution, and he had the courage to act, even when the entire world told him he was wrong. The explosion was not a single boom, it was a crack. A sharp, definitive snap of steel, followed by the sound of a giant tearing the sky in half. At 5:19 a.m. on June 12, 1944, the lead driver of a German ammunition convoy, code-named Cerberus 3, hit his brakes. He stared, confused, into his side mirror. The second truck in his line, the Opel Blitz, carrying 3 tons of artillery shells, had simply vanished. It hadn't slowed down. It hadn't stalled. It was gone. He stopped his engine, plunging the narrow alpine pass into a terrifying silence. Then, from the gorge 1,000 feet below, the sound finally reached him. A metallic scream, followed by a colossal, ground-shaking detonation that lit up the pre-dawn darkness like a new sun. The shockwave hit him seconds later, shattering his windshield. Before he could even scream, the third truck, braking desperately on the loose gravel, was struck by the fourth truck. The fifth truck slammed into them both. In less than 10 seconds, a chain reaction of fire and ammunition turned the Col du Diable, the Devil's Pass, into a vision of hell. When German investigators arrived, the pass was gone. The road itself had collapsed into the ravine. They found the lead driver, shell-shocked and babbling, miles away. He said the mountain ate the trucks. But one surviving guard, found clinging to a rock, whispered something else. something impossible. He said it wasn't partisans, it wasn't a bomb. He said it was a rope. This story, however, does not begin with an explosion. It begins 4 days earlier, with a 4-year-old woman named Elodie Giraud, and it begins with a sound the Nazis had long since learned to ignore: the gentle thud of a goat's hoof on stone. Elodie Giraud was invisible, not by training, but by design. In the German military maps of occupied France, the Vercors Massif was a fortress of peaks and shadows, home to the Maquis, the resistance. But Elodie was not Maquis. She was not a soldier. She was, in the eyes of the Reich, a statistic. Her father's farm, nestled in a high valley, had been requisitioned. Her brother, taken for labor in Germany, had not been heard from in 2 years. Elodie remained, officially designated as a goat herder for the local German garrison, feeding the men who had stolen her life. She lived in the ruins of her old barn, surviving on watery soup and a profound, bone-deep silence. The soldiers who saw her on the mountain paths barely registered her presence. A thin girl in a worn coat, her face smudged with dirt, her hands raw and calloused. But where the soldiers saw a ghost, they should have seen a weapon. Lotte Bauer, in Germany, had quiet hands that understood the language of steel. Elodie Giraud had mountain hands, hands that understood the language of rope, stone, and gravity. Before the war, she had helped her father move timber. She knew, with an instinct no engineer could teach, precisely how much tension a hemp rope could take before it snapped. She knew how to tie a knot that would tighten under load, not slip. She knew the secret language of leverage, and she knew the mountain. She knew the shortcuts the Maquis themselves had forgotten. She knew where the ground was solid granite, and where it was loose shale, waiting for a single, misplaced step to send it tumbling. Most importantly, she knew the Col du Diable, the Devil's Pass. It was the only route wide enough for the Wehrmacht supply trucks to cross the range, a ribbon of gravel carved into the side of a sheer 1,000-foot drop. For 3 years, she had watched them. Grinding convoys, heavy with guns, fuel, and ammunition, crawling past her goats, defiling her home. The Maquis had tried to stop them. They had planted bombs. They had staged ambushes. They had lost dozens of men to German machine guns. The pass was too open. The cliffs were too sheer. The convoys were too well guarded. The resistance saw an fortress. Elodie saw a flaw. She saw the flaw every morning at dawn. When she took her goats to the high pastures, she saw it in the way the morning light hit the rock, and in the way the wind whistled through the gorge. The Germans had made one fatal mistake. They had become bored. The convoys had run for 800 days without a single successful attack. The guards, once vigilant, now slouched in their seats, smoking, their rifles leaning against the truck doors. The drivers drove too fast, relying on the gravel berm, a low wall of piled stones and earth, no more than 2 feet high to keep them from the edge. They trusted that berm. They trusted it with their lives. Elodie Giraud did not. She had watched it all winter. She knew it was nothing but loose rock and frozen mud, weakened by the spring thaw, held together by arrogance. The idea did not come to her in a flash of brilliance, like Lotte's bicycle chain. It came to her slowly, born of patience and rockfall. It started with a goat, a young kid, separated from its mother, trapped on a ledge just below the pass. Elodie had climbed down to retrieve it, her bare hands gripping the rock, her feet searching for purchase. To get back up, she had used her father's old logging rope. As she pulled herself and the goat to safety, the rope dislodged a small boulder. It fell, striking the gravel berm on the road below. The entire section of the berm, 20 feet of it, crumbled like sugar and vanished into the gorge. She stared at the gap, her heart pounding in her chest. The kid bleated beside her. She stared at the rope in her hand. "Hemp!" Strong, flexible. A partisan would see a bomb. A soldier would see a machine gun. Elodie saw a 200-foot length of rope, a climbing harness, and a 400-pound boulder. She didn't need to destroy the road. She didn't need to fight the guards. She just needed to pull. She just needed to remove the one thing the drivers trusted. She needed to open a hole. The plan was insane. It was suicidal. It was, by all military definitions, a stupid, simple, impossible trick. And it would work. She spent the next 3 days preparing. She called it, in her mind, the trap. The resistance had workshops, explosives, networks. Elodie had a barn, a goat, and her father's tools. She found the boulder she needed, half buried in a stream bed, a mile above the pass. It was granite, roughly the size of a hay bale, and impossibly heavy. But she didn't need to lift it. She just needed to move it. Using her knowledge of leverage, she used smaller rocks as fulcrums, rolling the massive stone an inch at a time over 3 nights until it rested on a high ledge, directly overlooking the narrowest, most fragile section of the Devil's Pass. Next, she prepared her anchor. This was the most critical part. She couldn't attach the rope to the boulder. It would be found. She had to create a trigger. She found a dead pine tree, its roots still clinging to the rock face, 20 feet below the boulder. From there, she looped her main logging rope over a natural rock spur, creating a massive, crude pulley. One end she tied to the dead tree's trunk. The other she left dangling, hidden in a crevice. The boulder itself was held in place by a separate, smaller rope, her father's old climbing line. She tied this secondary rope to the trunk of a living, but very flexible, birch sapling. The mechanism was now a 2-stage trap. When she was ready, she would descend to the main rope, hidden below. She would pull it. The main rope would not pull the boulder. It would pull the dead pine tree. The pine tree, when it snapped, would rip the climbing rope from the birch sapling. Then, and only then, would 400 pounds of granite fall. It wouldn't fall onto the road. It would fall onto the berm. A high-velocity, precision strike designed to do one thing: erase the road's edge, seconds before the convoy arrived. The final piece was the most dangerous. She needed an anchor point for herself, a place to hide, a place to pull from, where she could see the convoy but not be seen. There was only one spot, a tiny, wind-blasted cave, no bigger than a coffin, set into the cliff face 500 feet directly below the pass. The soldiers called it the Eagle's Nest. Local legend said a man who hid there during a storm had gone mad from the sound of the wind. For Elodie, it was the only place. She coiled the main rope, strapped it to her back, and began the descent. It took her 4 hours, her fingers bleeding, her body aching, to reach the cave. She secured the rope, braced herself against the stone, and looked up. She could see it. A perfect 100-foot section of the Col du Diable, framed by the mouth of her cave. She was a spider, sitting in the center of her web. Now, she just had to wait for the flies. The night of June 11th was cold. A sharp wind howled up from the gorge, smelling of pine and damp earth. Elodie sat in the darkness, unmoving, her hands wrapped around the thick hemp rope. She did not sleep. She did not eat. She listened. She was not a soldier. She had no grand, political motive. Her brother was gone. Her father was dead. Her farm was occupied. The world had pushed her and pushed her until her back was against this very mountain. She was no longer angry. She was no longer afraid. Just before dawn, she heard it. Far below, in the valley, the faint, grinding rumble of heavy diesel engines climbing in low gear. Convoy Cerberus 3. 5 Opel Blitz trucks carrying ammunition for the 15th Army. Elodie stood up in her tiny cave. She unwrapped her hands, spat on her palms, and took a new, firmer grip on the rope. She could feel the granite vibrating, the trucks getting closer. The sound was deafening now. The lead truck appeared, its headlights cutting through the gray mist. It passed, 100 feet above her. Then the second truck. The one she wanted? She braced her feet against the back wall of the cave. She pulled. The rope went taut. She threw her entire 100-pound body against it. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. The rope stretched, groaning as it took the strain. Then, 500 feet above her, she heard the sound she had been waiting for. Crack. The sound of a dead pine tree snapping in two. The 400-pound granite boulder, released from its trigger, dropped. It fell 40 feet, struck the gravel berm with the force of a cannonball, and punched a 30-foot hole in the side of the road. It was perfect. The driver of the second truck, blinded by the headlights of the truck in front, saw the gap. Half a second too late. He slammed his brakes. But his front right tire found only air. The truck tilted. It hung there, balanced for an impossible, agonizing moment between the road and the abyss. The driver's mate screamed, then gravity won. The Opel Blitz, heavy with 3 tons of artillery shells, pitched forward and vanished into the darkness. Elodie watched it fall. It seemed to take forever. A black shape, tumbling end over end, growing smaller and smaller, until it hit the bottom of the gorge. The explosion was not a boom. It was the sound of the world ending. The shockwave that followed was indescribable. It was not wind. It was a wall. It slammed into Elodie, ripping the rope from her hands, flattening her against the stone. She watched, stunned, as the remaining trucks, blinded by the flash, slammed into one another. The third truck, its cargo of mortar rounds cooking off, exploded. Then the fourth. The pass itself, weakened by the first explosion and battered by the subsequent blasts, began to crumble. The entire section of road where the convoy had stood simply broke away from the mountain and collapsed into the ravine. By 5:21 a.m., it was over. 5 trucks, their drivers, and 14 guards were gone. The Col du Diable was impassable. Elodie Giraud remained in her cave, deafened, her hair singed, her hands raw and bleeding. She stared at the burning chasm where the road used to be. The soldiers in the garrison would blame the Maquis. The Maquis would claim the victory. Engineers would write reports about geological instability and partisan explosives. No one, ever, would believe it was one woman. The silence that followed the explosions was heavier, more profound, than the noise that came before. It was a dead, ringing void, filled only by the hiss of burning tires and the groan of cooling metal far below. Elodie Giraud lay on the cold stone of her cave for a full hour. Her hands were useless, shredded by the rope. Her ears rang with the ghosts of the detonations. She was trapped, 1,000 feet up a sheer cliff, with no easy way down. Her escape would be harder than the attack. She had to retrieve the main rope, her only way up. But the shockwave had jammed it, wedging it between 2 pieces of granite. She pulled, her bloody hands slipping on the hemp. It wouldn't budge. For the first time, panic, cold and sharp, cut through her shock. The Germans would come. They would bring search teams, soldiers, dogs. They would scour this mountain until they found a reason. If they found her here, her death would be the kindest thing they offered. She took her father's old knife, the one she used for cutting goat cheese, and began to saw at the rope. Not to cut it free, but to shred it, thinning it, fiber by fiber, until she could tear it loose. It took another hour. Each pull sent fire up her arms. Finally, with a sound like a dry cough, the rope ripped free from the rock. She couldn't climb. Her hands were ruined. She would have to descend. She wrapped the rope around her waist, leaned back into the void, and began a desperate, uncontrolled rappel into the gorge, away from the pass, away from the burning trucks, into the one place the Germans would never look. the shadow of the abyss itself. By noon, the first German patrol arrived. It was not an investigation team. It was a conquest. Major Karl Brandt of the Wehrmacht's Engineering Corps stood at the edge of the chasm, his face pale with fury. Brandt was not a Gestapo thug. He was a man of logic. A man who believed in physics, stress loads, and concrete. What he was looking at was impossible. The Col du Diable was gone, not damaged, not cratered, erased. The Maquis, his sergeant spat, gesturing at the wreckage. They used 1,000 kilos of explosives. They must have been digging for weeks. Brandt walked to the edge, ignoring the sergeant. He knelt, touching the fractured stone. No, he said, his voice quiet. This was not an explosive charge. Major, the rock is fractured outward. An internal charge, a bomb in the road, would have left a crater, a bowl shape. This is a gash, as if the road was pulled from the mountain. He looked up, scanning the opposing cliff face. Nothing, just bare rock. He looked down into the gorge. The fires were still burning, casting a sickly orange light. Geological instability, the sergeant offered, reading from the initial field report. The vibrations from the lead truck must have. Must have what? Brandt snapped. Caused a perfectly timed, selective earthquake that only affected the road after the lead truck was safe and during the passage of an ammunition convoy? No. This was an act, but it was not a bomb. Brandt was a builder. He saw the world in terms of construction and deconstruction. And this was a masterpiece of deconstruction. Get me the mountain infantry, Brandt ordered. I want every rock on that opposite cliff face inspected. I want every trail, every ledge, every cave. He was convinced the attack had come from a sniper's nest, perhaps a new type of anti-tank rocket he hadn't heard of. He was still thinking in terms of weapons. He had not yet begun to think in terms of rope. While Brandt's men searched the cliffs, Elodie was miles away, crawling through the icy river at the bottom of the gorge. The freezing water was the only thing that kept her from fainting from the pain in her hands. It washed away the blood, the gunpowder residue, and her scent. By nightfall, she had climbed back up the other side of the valley, emerging near her own ruined barn like a ghost returning to its grave. She stumbled inside, collapsed onto her straw mattress, and for 12 hours she did not move. When she woke, the garrison was in a state of panic. The Maquis, smelling German blood, had already claimed responsibility. Radio transmissions, intercepted by the British, proudly announced that the Vercors resistance had dealt a crippling blow to the occupier, destroying a vital supply line. This, perversely, was the best thing that could have happened to Elodie. The Germans wanted to believe it was the Maquis. It was an enemy they understood, an enemy they could round up, interrogate, and execute. SS patrols, summoned by the disaster, descended on the nearby villages. Reprisals began. The mayor of a neighboring town was shot. 10 men were taken as hostages. The Maquis, having claimed the victory, now had to deal with the consequences. And Major Brandt. He was not satisfied. His search teams had found nothing. No sniper's nest, no rocket casings, no bomb fragments. On the third day, a young private, dangling from a rope 500 feet below the pass, found something. It wasn't a weapon. It was a clue. It was a piece of a length of dead pine, scarred and splintered. But the break, it wasn't a natural break. It had been snapped by an immense, sudden force. And wrapped deep in its bark, the private found a single, 2-inch fiber of old hemp rope. Brandt held the fiber in his glove. He looked at the shattered pine. He looked up at the cliff face, high above, where the boulder had once rested. His mind began to work, not like a soldier, but like the engineer he was. He saw the forces. He saw the vectors, a trigger, a pulley, A counterweight. It wasn't a bomb, he whispered to himself. It was a trap. A deadfall. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. A bomb was brute force. This was intelligence. This was elegant. And it meant the saboteur was not Maquis. The Maquis used dynamite. They were soldiers. This was something else. This was local. Someone who knew this mountain. Someone who knew how to move timber, how to work with rope. Someone like a farmer, or a logger, or a goat herder. His search had been focused on the men. His worldview had been focused on soldiers. He had made a critical, arrogant mistake. "Sergeant," Brandt said, his voice cold, "get me the records for every civilian registered in this valley. Every man, every woman, every child. I want to know who lives on this mountain." The hunt had changed. He was no longer looking for an army. He was looking for a single, invisible person. The next morning, Elodie was outside her barn, trying to milk her goat. Her hands were wrapped in dirty rags, her face pale. She told the garrison soldiers who passed that she had fallen, that her hands were stupid and had slipped. She watched a staff car grind up the road. Major Brandt stepped out. He was not like the other soldiers. He didn't shout. He didn't posture. He just looked. He walked through the tiny village, his eyes missing nothing. He noted the logging tools hanging in a shed, the coils of rope used for livestock. He was cataloging a population of experts. Then he saw Elodie. He walked over, his boots crunching on the gravel. She did not look up, keeping her head bowed, her hands fumbling with the goat. "You live here," he stated. "Yes, Herr Major," she whispered, her French thick with a local accent. "You are the goat herder. You walk these mountains every day." "Yes, Herr Major, for the garrison, for—" He stared at her. At her thin frame, her dirty face, her submissive posture. This was a ghost. A non-entity. He should have moved on. But then, his eyes fell to her hands. The rags were soaked, not just with dirt, but with a faint, reddish-brown stain, and they were wrapped tightly. Not like someone who had a simple fall, but like someone trying to bind a catastrophic injury. He saw the raw, shredded skin peeking out. Those were not scrapes. Those were rope burns. A deep, cold silence settled between them. Elodie could feel his gaze on her hands. She stopped breathing, her heart a cold stone in her chest. Brandt looked from her hands to the coil of hemp rope hanging on her barn door, and then up, toward the Col du Diable, its broken form just visible in the distance. He didn't know. He couldn't know, but a single, terrible, mathematical equation was forming in his mind. He leaned in, his voice soft, almost sympathetic. "That's a terrible injury," he said, gesturing to her hands. "How, exactly? Did you say you fell?" Elodie's mind went blank. The world narrowed to this single moment. The goat herder and the engineer. The ghost and the hunter. She had to answer. The wrong word. The wrong pause. And her life was over. Elodie's heart was not a drum. It was a block of ice. She forced her body to tremble, to shake, not with defiance, but with the pathetic terror he expected. She looked up, her eyes wide, tears welling. She did not look at his face, but at his chest, at the iron cross pinned to his uniform. "Fell, Herr Major," she whimpered, her voice cracking. My goat, the little one. He was on the high rocks. I climbed. The rope. It slipped. I am stupid. So stupid." She was feeding him the exact words he wanted to hear. Stupid. Clumsy. A woman. Brandt stared at her, his eyes like blue ice. He saw the rope burns. He saw the coil of rope on the barn. He saw the chasm where his convoy used to be, and he saw a 4-year-old girl crying, her hands ruined because of a goat. It was too perfect. It was too convenient. Or was it the simple, idiotic truth? His mind, the mind of an engineer, raced. Could she have done it? Could this child have conceived and executed a plan of this complexity? To move a 400-pound boulder, rig a 2-stage trigger, and rappel into a cave 500 feet down a sheer cliff. All in secret? It was absurd. It was impossible. And yet, the alternative, that the Maquis had built an invisible, silent, perfect weapon, was just as impossible. He was trapped between two realities, one that was insulting and one that was terrifying. But he was also a soldier, and he needed a culprit. The SS were demanding arrests. Berlin was demanding answers. Which goat? He asked, his voice flat. Elodie pointed, her shaking, bandaged hand gesturing to a small white kid chewing on a weed. That one, Herr Major. He is a devil. Brandt looked at the goat. He looked back at Elodie. He saw the terror in her eyes, the dirt on her face. And he made his choice. He could not arrest this woman. What would he write in his report? Sabotage suspect, 1 goat herder. Evidence, rope burns and a disobedient goat. He would be the laughingstock of the Wehrmacht. His career would be over. No. The Maquis had to be the enemy. The honor of the German army demanded it. He turned away from her, his mind made up. He would write in his report that he had found nothing, that the Maquis explosives, combined with geological instability, had destroyed the site so completely that no evidence remained. It was a clean, bureaucratic answer. Be more careful, Brandt said, his voice hard. He did not look at her again. Keep your goats off the high rocks and get those hands cleaned. You are a disgrace to the Reich's hygiene standards. He got back in his car. The door slammed, a sound as final as a gunshot. Elodie Giraud watched the car drive away, the dust settling in its wake. She did not move. She did not breathe. The ice in her chest did not melt. She waited until the sound of his engine was gone. Then she walked into her barn, gathered a half loaf of bread, her father's knife, and the remaining coil of rope. She did not look back. She did not run. She simply walked. Up into the high mountains, toward the snow line, following the paths only the goats knew. By nightfall, Elodie Giraud was gone. Major Brandt returned to his office. He filed his report, blaming the Maquis. The reprisal killings continued. The Maquis, believing their own propaganda, grew bolder, launching 2 more attacks. But Brandt was haunted. He couldn't sleep. He kept seeing those rope burns. He kept seeing the physics of the trap. He, the master engineer, had been defeated by what? He was recalled 2 months later. His failure at the pass, a black mark on his record. His superiors noted he had become unreliable, obsessed. He was transferred to the Eastern Front to supervise the destruction of bridges during the Great Retreat. A builder, forced to become a demolitions man. And the pass? The Col du Diable? It was never rebuilt. The German engineers, lacking the heavy equipment, could only clear a narrow mule track. For the rest of the war, all heavy supplies for the 15th Army had to be rerouted 200 kilometers to the south. The delay was catastrophic. The ammunition in those 5 trucks, the artillery shells, the mortar rounds, had been destined for the coastal batteries in Normandy. When the Allies landed, just weeks later, several German artillery positions, the ones that should have raked the beaches, were reported dangerously low on ammunition. They were overrun in hours. History, in its grand, sweeping narrative, recorded the D-Day landings as a triumph of strategy. It never recorded the goat herder whose stupid rope trick had silently disarmed a key part of the Atlantic Wall. Élodie Giraud was never seen again. Official records, if they ever existed, were lost. Her name was not on any list of Maquis heroes. She was not in any report. She vanished into the mountains she had saved. But like Lot Bauer's chain link, the story did not die. It just went quiet. Decades later, in the 1982nd, a young historian was studying the German occupation of the Vercors. He was digging through the unfiled archives of Major Karl Brandt, which had been recovered from his estate in Berlin. Most of it was dry engineering notes, stresses, load barriers, concrete mixtures, but then the historian found a private journal. On a page dated June 15, 1944, Brandt had written a long, frantic entry, not in official German, but in hurried, personal script. "It was not the Maquis," he wrote. "The search was clean. No explosives, nothing. But I found the trigger point, a snapped pine, and I found her. The goat girl with the hands. Gott in Himmel! The rope burns on her hands. She looked me in the eye and lied, and I let her. How can a man build a 1,000-year Reich if he can be defeated by a girl, a goat, and a piece of rope?" The historian read the entry, stunned. He checked the official reports. There was no mention of a girl, no mention of a rope. The story was invisible. It existed only in the burn marks on a woman's hands and in the private, humiliated confession of a Nazi engineer. The historian would later add a small anonymous footnote to his book. 1. Unverified, and likely apocryphal. Report suggests the Col du Diable incident was not a partisan attack, but a deliberate act of sabotage by a local civilian. Possibly a woman. That was all. A footnote, but the legend. In the valley, the old ones still tell it. They don't talk about the Maquis. They talk about l'esprit de la chèvre, the spirit of the goat. They say that when the arrogance of men grows too loud, a silence returns to the mountains. A silence that knows how to tie knots. The film would end here. The camera drifting over the Col du Diable, now a green, grassy scar on the side of the mountain. Peaceful, beautiful. The narrator's voice, low and measured, would linger over the final lines. Wars are fought with armies, with steel, with grand strategies, but they are won and lost in moments of impossible human choice. The Reich was a machine of perfect, brutal logic. Élodie Giraud was a simple mountain equation. She didn't fight the machine. She didn't try to destroy it. She just found the flaw in its arrogance. She cut the one rope it trusted and let gravity do the rest. The sound fades. Only the faint whistling of wind over a high mountain pass, and perhaps in the distance, the faint, hollow thud of a single goat's hoof, landing on stone.